Good afternoon. This afternoon, I would like to share briefly something that, an exciting thing that is happening within the Navigators Kenya. You've heard stories about how the ministry started in Kenya a number of years ago, and how God has used different ones in the advance of the gospel in Kenya. Bruce alluded to how the work started and the many people that were here. And Professor Deuri also mentioned some of those things. We are trusting God to see this ministry grow, and many of you have been part and parcel of this work. One of the areas that has been on our hearts is that how do we continue to fund the advance of the gospel in Kenya, in Africa, and beyond? We are grateful to men like Bruce and Mag, Over Tingard, Parulov, Mike Trenier, for the faith they exercised in buying the different premises that we have. They bought Kindaruma Road, and then they bought Mushai Road. And successive country leaders have developed those plots. They have developed them in a way that we are grateful to God that we do not have to raise money to manage our admin. They even had 2 houses in Ngumo which we sold, and with the energy and vision of Dr. Mkolo, we were able to put out the tower that is at Kindaruma Road. And one of the things we've been asking ourselves, how do we want to see the work funded? We are trusting God to see the work in Kenya strongly funded from within Kenya in ways that are biblically sound and financially prudent. So the Kenya board, we have some board members here, please. Can I see our board members? The chairman, Mrs. Mugo, Mr. Ndigi. Yeah, our board chair, Professor Jaoko, Mrs. Mahinda, Mr. Ndigi, and Mrs. Mugo. The board decided to come up with a funding committee. This committee was to explore ways in which we as Kenyans can look at how to fund the advance of the gospel for posterity. And the questions they were asking, what do you need funding for if your admin is catered for? All of you give to different staff for the advance of the gospel, for their salaries and their ministries. The rental income we get is around 11 to 15 million maximum, and most of it goes into paying salaries for the staff who are employed, and then paying property tax, paying insurance, and a very small amount of it, about 1.5 million, is the only one that is available to go into the field ministry. So this committee was asked, what do you need money for? And they said, we need money for leader development, continuous leader development. We need money to expand into the new frontiers we are calling the rural, the urban poor, the marketplace, and peoples of other faiths. And they explored different ways of funding. And I'll invite Mr. Gatende to share some of his story, and then he'll invite the team that is working it to share some of the proposals that they have come up with. So if you are with Mr. Gatende, be ready for him to invite you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. Let me just say that we started when we began on Thursday by introducing ourselves and saying the background, talking about when we first interacted with the Navigators. And my history goes back to 1975. I put my hand up when Stanley asked how many gave their lives to Christ at a crusade, and that was at the Kenya Polytechnic in 1975. It was the same year. So shortly after that, I met Steve Randolph, and I also, that same year, I met Ova and Anne-Marie, and I was still in Form 1 at Lenana School. So some of the people who've been up here, when I said I have known them since they were teenagers, it's because we went to high school together. They were a little bit ahead of me, Nick and Mugo, amongst others, Oduno, I'm sure there are others, Anzaya, of course, and others. Anyway, I continued in my involvement with the Navigators and got involved in the Form 1 CU. I got involved in the committee. We have a committee at Lenana that was used to reach out to the other students. And the Bible studies that we used to have, and you talked about the slips of paper that were put into pockets. By the time it came around to us, it was called the topical memory system. And I guess that's where the whole idea of memorizing scripture began, and it's become a lifelong discipline. I then went to Canada and got involved with the Navigators at McGill University, and they were just starting the ministry there. I met some people, and we used to go from in the halls of residence, sharing the gospel and getting people into Bible study. And I came back in 1984. I stayed with my parents on the farm for a year, and then I started looking for a job. And I was offered a job at Kenya Cannas. You remember Kenya Cannas? In Thika. And at the same time, John O'Hare spoke to me about considering being involved with the NAV ministry, on the high school ministry. And so with Auntie Sarah, and Beulah, who else was on that ministry? Bruce and Tricia Nygaard, Jack and Miriam Warren. There were a number of others as well. We ministered together. And so that was an exciting phase. I was on staff for a year on something that Bruce had raised funds for. It was called the National Trainee Program. And it really made a difference. It was a wonderful time for us. If you think memorizing Romans 8 is a big deal, with John O'Hare, we memorized the whole book of Ephesians. Chapter 1 through chapter 6. Yeah. And so, what's 39 verses in Romans 8? It's a good thing, isn't it? But the investment that I got there was something that I shall never forget. And so to this day, in my giving to the Navigators, I have set aside something that I say, this I want to go to the national trainees. And so it's not a lot, because I was asking Chris about it. He says there are now 24, I think, he said. And so in addition to whichever other staff I support, there's something in there for the national trainees. Then Mutua asked me to chair the board, the Navigators board. And so I did that with some of the people. Walter was saying, what is he still doing there? And Margaret Karangada. Who else was? Jesse, of course. And who else was with us in those days? Yes, Patricia. Patricia Wasau. So we did that for a number of years, and they have continued. And so my involvement has been varied over the years. And so lately, Chris has asked the likes of, I'm going to call you up now, Sarah and Wanjiko, if you could come up. This, as he said, this proposal was made by Chris, and the board approved that we could be part of the raising funds for what is called the Endowment Fund. And so the three of us and another gentleman called Kevin Kanyotu, and so we're part of the Endowment Fund. An endowment fund, what is it?
What is an endowment fund? It is a combination of funds donated by benefactors, which is managed under different kinds of legal structures. With what happens is that the benefactor would normally set conditions for how they want that money spent. Generally, with endowment funds, the principal is left intact, while the income from the investing activities is then released to the ministry objectives. There are three ways in which, three structures, if I may call that, legal structures under which we can do this in Kenya. So it's really quite simple. It's saying, as we all age, do we want to see this work grow? How can we do it? Some of us are beginning to write our wills. If you haven't yet, Tamati will tell you. how do you want those money spent? Or even while you're alive, how do you fund this work? How do you grow the fund? Number one is obviously investing. We would be looking to investing the monies that are donated into the fund into various places, money market funds. What shall we say? In Kenya, there aren't a whole host of things to invest in. There's the stock market, which can drive you mad as you go in there and you see your money is losing value, or you can go with the money market funds, which are they're less risky and but they don't have as exciting returns either. But we'd probably be going in that direction to keep it a little more conservative and growing. So that's one way, investing, and the other is raising new capital. And David will be talking to us about the whole raising new capital. How are we going to start and that journey going forward? So that's really it. I think I will leave it at that for now. Having worked on it, that's the type of fund we are going for. We then debated how much money should go into this fund. What's our Fund 1 target? And because when Chris first put together, the board first put together the funding committee, we'd been asked to raise 25 million shillings to put up a new building on Kindaruma Road. And we thought about it and we said to Chris that we didn't, well, to Chris and then back to the board, that didn't make any sense because of all the other much nicer property that's gone up around the Navigators. A lot of it is empty. You'd be putting up, it's a huge amount of cash you put in and the income is not so certain. But we went with the 25 million shilling fund. That's where we want to start, with 25 million shillings. But what does that 25 million shillings do in relation to the budget? The Tufike Mia is saying we need 21.5 million shillings in ink of an injection, if I may call it that, every year. Where do we get the 21.5 million shillings? And I actually want to call Sarah up to talk through those economics. What does 25 million shillings do for us? You will see as she talks that it doesn't actually fully fund this. And so we need to talk about other options. Sarah, if you're ready.
So Wajiko talked about an endowment fund. In essence, really, it's just a pool of money that's invested in order to yield a return. I work for a university that's funded by just endowments. Even the organization I work for is funded by an endowment. Okay, fine. So in essence, we made an assumption that to start with, perhaps we'd be able to raise 25 million. And when that 25 million is invested, it would yield a return net of tax of about 9%. So we estimated it could probably return, just being conservative, but well managed, could return an investment yield of 9% net of tax. The fund itself is growing because every year people are donating more at about 15% of the initial 25 million. And then the new contributions every year, 50% of those would earn interest income because of, the full interest return of 9%. So the full investment return of 9%. So at the end of the 5 years, with 15% going in, we would have 50 million at the end. And so that is sort of how the trajectory would be over the 5 years, where you start with 25 million, that's the yellow. You're getting new gifts in red, and you're getting investment income in the green. So at the end of 5 years, you've got slightly more than 50 million because of the investment return. Now, even with that, and we've also estimated for a second fund, and I don't want to make it complicated, so I won't talk about that. Even with that, you would only be able to finance 16% of the ministry budget with the investment income from the endowment. If we, in 2020, and then going up 25% by 2024. So, you know, how would you deal with that gap? In essence, what we're saying is, even if you get a building and you get 9%, you invest in a building, you get a yield of 9%, you know, as rent return, you're still going to get a funding gap. You're not going to be able to finance the full ministry need. So what does that mean? What could be the options for bridging the funding gap? So this is where I'll hand over back to David to talk through what the options might be.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So we have a number of options which have already been presented to the board, and you see them here. We don't want any alarm to be caused, but we've had some good presentations so far. And the one that was done by Dennis, for example, about investments and so on, we felt was a very good precursor to what we're presenting. Let me just say that we've talked about the endowment fund, and I want to launch it in a moment. But we also presented these to the board. Who was it who was here just now? I think it was Chris who was talking about the wisdom that Bruce and the original leaders expressed when they bought the land. And we heard from John Gishinga how in those days it was not the done thing. Evangelical ministries were not involved in buying land and developing, and so it was a very, very advanced and very leading edge. And so the land that we have at the NAV office is a real asset, and in order to develop it further, like Stan and his team did, we needed to sell some apartments that we had. Again, had they not been bought in the first place, they wouldn't have been available to develop. And so that's one of the proposals, that we could sell part or all of the Navigator property and reinvest it and get something that is purpose-built and have money left over. But that's not something that is, we realize there's a lot of emotion attached to this, but let's just remember some of the things that we were told, that assets are there to serve us, and they're not for us to get too attached to. But we don't want to push an agenda. We want to raise it as an issue. It's already been mentioned to the board, and we'll just leave it at that. We can also raise funds from other churches. It's something that Jesse is very big on. He was talking about it just now. There are many who are in the Navigator diaspora, so to speak, who have benefited from the ministry, who would like to continue receiving discipleship from people who are involved. And what we were just talking about with Anzaya and Bide, Tamati is another example of something that has come from the Navigators that could be a blessing and could lead to others being involved in raising funds from churches. So one of the things that we need to do is to begin seed funding. In order to establish the endowment fund, it's very important that there is money that is put in that will be the core asset. And the principal sum is not touched. We live off of the interest. And the idea is that the interest will provide from the endowment fund. However, as Sarah just mentioned, and I think it was also mentioned by Shiko, it is not going to be enough. Even when it is fully funded with 50 million shillings, it will raise a quarter of what is required. And so we have already had some money that has been put in to start this off, but I want here at the seniors conference to launch it so that as people are thinking about their future retirement, Wanjiko mentioned people can put it in their wills, they can bequeath some money, but we don't have to wait until we pass on. Even now, while we're living, we can put money there, and the interest is what will benefit the ministry. So we have already received an initial input, and we're going to be seeking and approaching people individually, both in this group and others who are not here, within the Navigators first of all, and then beyond, to see how we can raise and fully fund the endowment fund. It has already been seeded with 1 million shillings to start with, and there will be more to follow. So I just want to thank the team for the work that's been done so far, and we're going to carry on from here. If there are any other questions, please feel free to direct them through us or through Chris. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jesse.